I'd like to welcome everyone to DeSales University and our celebration of the R. Wayne Kraft Memorial Lecture. This year, our lecture closes out our 50th anniversary version of Heritage Week, when we recount the legacy of Christian humanism given to us by our patron saint, Francis de Sales. Now, Deacon Wayne Kraft was a shining example of that Christian humanist tradition. He was a respected professor of metallurgy and material science at Lehigh University, that small school on the other side of the mountain. He held 2 patents and authored more than 50 articles and reports in technical and professional journals. But he was also fascinated by philosophy. And on this feast day of St. Thomas Aquinas, happy feast day to all the philosophers. Professor Kraft offered a course here at our institution on the thought of Teilhard de Chardin, about whom he wrote 3 books. With de Chardin, Professor Kraft was keenly interested in bridging the gap between the secular and the sacred, in the hope of transforming the world. The Kraft Lecture Series carries on this hope. We remain grateful to the Kraft family for sponsoring this series, and we assure you of our continued prayers for your father and your mother, Joan, who passed away just last month. Bridging gaps in the hope of transforming our world. This is also the work of our Kraft lecturer this evening, though he does it more by communication than by philosophy. A priest in the congregation of St. Basil, his own studies have bridged the gap between the Bible and our world. He holds advanced degrees in sacred scripture from Regis College in Toronto, the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, and the École Biblique in Jerusalem. He worked to bridge the gap between young and old when he served for 3 years as the National Director of World Youth Day and the visit of Pope John Paul II that took place in Toronto in 2002. Following that, he founded the Salt and Light Catholic Media Foundation and still serves as its chief executive officer. As Canada's first Catholic television network, and now reaching across the continents, Salt and Light TV bridges the gap between faith and culture through the medium of storytelling to bring people closer to Christ and our Catholic faith. And since 2008, our speaker has been busy bridging the gap between the church and the world by serving on the staff of the Press Office of the Holy See. As an official spokesperson, he brings the news about Pope Francis and the Vatican to the entire English-speaking world through his daily interactions with all the media. So tonight, we are honored that he has come to Center Valley as the 11th Kraft Memorial Lecture. Please join me in welcoming Father Thomas Rosica.
Thank you, Father Tom. One of the students asked me, "Are you the one who was supposed to come?" I felt like that was asked in the New Testament too. So I said, I am not he, I am the voice of the one in the wilderness. Thank you very much for inviting me to DeSales University. This is my first time here. It's a great honor and privilege to visit you and to have shared dinner just now with the Kraft family. I'm sorry I did not know your parents, but I feel that I know them having been with you at the meal. Jesus would have been very happy in this area. As I was coming here tonight, as I was driving in this morning with Father Tom, I saw the rolling hills, the fields, the farms, the hills and the valleys, and of course Bethlehem next door. Except Jesus would not have appreciated the snow, but everything else would have been a great teaching opportunity. The parables make much more sense in this kind of a setting than they do in big cities where you see concrete buildings. Being here is also a great opportunity for me to reconnect with the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales, who have been a very important part of my own formation, religious and theological formation in my years in Toronto. having sat at the feet of one of the great oblate scripture scholars, Father Anthony Ceresco, now gone to God, having experienced the wonderful pastoral leadership of Father David Whalen, who taught on the faculty of our school in Toronto, having had the privilege of studying with people like this wonderful priest in the back row who came from Toledo to join your faculty, Father John and Father Ken, and so many others. And then I had the privilege of teaching many of the young scholastics for the Oblates in Toronto. What a happy, wonderful community. And this is not a paid service announcement. You people are blessed to be associated with the OSFS. They also had one of the best party houses in Toronto for the religious communities. This evening I want to speak to you. In fact, I've entitled my talk, Francis de Sales and Francis of Buenos Aires. Two guys named Francis, who communicate the gospel. And many of us these past years have been spending our time making the similarities between Pope Francis and the Ignatian roots, because he's a good, faithful Jesuit. So we talk about Francis as a great son of Ignatius of Loyola, or Francis as a spitting image of Francis of Assisi. And nobody's really picked up on Francis, the Pope, and Francis de Sales. So to start off my presentation tonight, I want to just highlight a couple of the salient features, the salient qualities of Francis de Sales, and see how Francis of Buenos Aires, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Pope Francis, really brings them to life. Before speaking about these two men, let's take the long view over the Church's efforts to communicate the gospel over these past 2,000 plus years. In every age, I stress that, the Church has used whatever media are available to spread the good news. St. Augustine probably invented the form of autobiography. The builders of the great medieval cathedrals and stone-glass windows taught us. The Renaissance popes not only used papal bulls, but colorful frescoes, and they paid the artists very cheaply. Hildegard of Bingen wrote the first operas. Francis de Sales wrote countless letters. The early Jesuits used theater and stagecraft to put on morality plays for entire towns. Dorothy Day, who achieved a new level of fame this past September in the United States Congress, founded a newspaper that continues to this day, The Catholic Worker. Jesuit Father Daniel Lord jumped into radio. Bishop Fulton Sheen used television long before Mother Angelica was around. He used television to a stunning effect to get Emmy Awards with it. And nowadays, we've got bishops and priests and sisters and brothers and Catholic lay people blogging and tweeting until all hours of the day and night. How sad would it be if we did not use the latest tools available to us to communicate the word? And that's what I want to stress tonight. To talk to you about Francis de Sales and Francis of Buenos Aires, it's all about communicating the word in unconventional ways in their own periods. The spirituality of Francis de Sales flowed out of his experiences as a missionary priest, a bishop, a spiritual director, an author, and a founder of religious orders. Francis de Sales was educated by the Jesuits. There's the first link that's here. Educated by the Jesuits at the Collège de Clermont in Paris and at the University of Padua. He was renowned for his ministry as spiritual director and writer. He wrote more than 20,000 letters during his lifetime. Perhaps in our age of computers and email communication, this seemingly large number may not seem as impressive as it was in the 17th century. But over 400 years ago, there were no large databases, no mega hard drives, no iCloud, no copy machines, or bulk mailings. In those times, he had to write letters by hand. When was the last time you wrote a letter by hand without all those crazy symbols and faces and everything else and abbreviated words that don't have vowels in them? Francis de Sales was convinced by others to collect, organize, and expand on as many letters addressing spiritual subjects. He published those letters in the year 1609, before most of you were born, under the title Introduction to the Devout Life. This work would become his most famous work. But Francis's special project was the writing of a book called The Treatise of Love of God, published in 1616, over which he prayed and labored for many years. I'm stressing these things because you're going to see some links and similarities to what Francis of Buenos Aires has done in Argentina and what he continues to do now in Rome at Casa Santa Marta. Francis de Sales' letters, revealed his spiritual counsel offered to so many people, which touch upon the most personal questions from those who asked him for his advice and for words of consolation. They include episcopal decrees to pastors and abbots, canonical and liturgical instructions for reforms, short theological letters on questions about the true teachings of the faith, or preparation for the office of bishop, detailed accounts on political and ecclesiastical situations of his diocese and of his country. The letters were written to people like the Duke of Savoy, to the kings of France, to papal nuncios, to episcopal friends, and even to the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. We're talking about somebody who had voluminous correspondence. He communicated with people. If we remember Francis de Sales today, is it not for the call to holiness to all people from all walks of life, the necessity of living in the present moment as the privileged opportunity to know and to live God's will, the goodness of creation, the centrality of love and freedom in one's relationship with God and world, the sanctity of the ordinary things that are done passionately well, and for his gentleness, his humility, his optimism and joy that come from living in truthfulness. Francis de Sales would be thrilled to see Francis of Buenos Aires in action today. Thank God that later on, a French priest by the name of Louis Brisson, and I think I saw a building today named after him, Brisson would found a congregation of priests and brothers that would carry on the mission of St. Francis de Sales. The mission of a holy priest, a holy bishop, a pastor of souls, and a writer of many letters. One of my Basilian confreres, by Basilian it's St. Basil, it's not million or bazillion or whatever, because we're less than 200 right now. So everybody said, wow, you guys got a lot of vocations, you know. We're the millionaire fathers or the bazillionaire fathers. It's St. Basil, father of the church of the 4th century. One of my Basilian confreres was a priest named Father William Marceau. Bill was a Basilian, but he was much more Salesian than Basilian. And he taught me French. In my real life, I wanted to be a French and Italian teacher. I've done nothing that I've set out to do. But Father Bill taught us French, but every single class had to have a 10-minute segment on Francis de Sales, or on Jean-François de Chantal. Remember, a lot of us were fed up with it all the time. We want to do verbs. But now I'm so grateful because I kept all of those notes, and there was the little pearls of wisdom about François de Sales. Everything was François de Sales. Au nom du Père et du Fils et du Saint-Esprit, we're going to do François de Sales. And somebody would have to raise their hand and say, we're on the past tense verbs now. Let's get there. Bill was much more Salesian than French. And I distinctly remember Father Bill expounding on Francis de Sales' mastery of the language of Molière. He said de Sales wrote beautifully in French. But the other thing that Father Bill stressed with us is that Francis de Sales always placed himself in the shoes of those he addressed. He never wrote above their heads. He didn't make any distinctions because somebody was important or somebody had a high job or somebody was a widow or a little poor person that was writing to him for consolation. He treated everybody the same, and he always said, what would I feel like if I were receiving this letter? His letters exhibit a great deal of respect of the human person, and the personal questions each person, and therefore they were important to him. Thus he tried to take the matter at hand as seriously as if it were the most important thing in the world. And there's nothing more beautiful than that, when you know you're dealing with somebody and they treat you as if there's nobody else in the world but you. And I have to say, working closely with Pope Francis these past 3 years, that's exactly the sentiment I feel. That in one moment he's dealing with the king and queen of a country, And the next moment, he's dealing with the street people who broke their way into the Vatican, and he's carrying on with them and petting the dog and everything else that's with them. It's an incredible sight and experience, and they all feel so important. What the letters of Francis de Sales reveal are inspired common sense, keen awareness of the practical dimension to holiness. Always drawing on the positive, he was able to teach people to find God wherever they were and to love God in whatever they were doing. And along the way, Francis de Sales exemplified the virtues of something that's really been lost today, spiritual friendship. Spiritual friendship. Not friending people with crazy Facebook stuff, but spiritual friendship. And when you have a spiritual friendship, it is unfriendable. You don't unfriend it, okay? You keep it. It's a great gift. His imaginative power is clearly directed to a practical end. His writings address the common needs of everyday people. He speaks to us in the ordinary, and that's why so many people could understand what Francis de Sales was doing. Is it any wonder that in addition to all of the other things, being a saint, he's proclaimed a doctor of the church, not because he holds highfalutin degrees from Paris or Padua, but a doctor of the church is somebody who heals souls. Thérèse of Lisieux never did graduate study. She never went to university. She's a doctor of the church because her simple way healed so many people. Those are the robes that these doctors wear. Not only academic, but the ability to heal souls. For that reason, Francis de Sales has much to teach us today, and I'm not at all surprised that he's the patron saint of journalists and all of us involved in communications work. Now let's talk about Francisco of Buenos Aires. From the very first moments of his Petrine ministry, soon to be 3 years, Francis of Buenos Aires has stressed his role with the ancient title, the Bishop of Rome, who presides in charity echoing famous statement of Ignatius of Antioch. There's no question about Francis's deep Ignatian and Jesuit roots. Francis has quoted several times over the past 3 years this Jesuit maxim or saying, non coerci maximo continere tamen a minimo divinum est. Now, just in case you don't remember some of the Latin, this is what it means. It's a very important line. To suffer no restriction from anything, however great, and yet to be contained in the tiniest of things, this is divine. Let me explain that. This was composed in 1640 as a way to describe the genius of Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius's genius was this: to hold together the great and the small, the global and the local, in a tension of seemingly opposites. Ignatius, with his worldwide vision and desire to set the world on fire. Francis of Buenos Aires, a true Jesuit, keeps in mind and heart great visions and dreams. The larger picture, but at the same time, he urges us to reach down and go out to the peripheries to serve the needy and the vulnerable. Ignatius of Loyola was able to combine severity and sweetness, rigor and gentleness. He was always ready to make exceptions. This is very important. The key to Ignatius of Loyola and the key to Pope Francis is the gift of discernment. First knowing what is big and what is little, and then correcting the big and glossing over the small, always keeping the whole, the larger picture, in mind. Discernment is at the heart of this pontificate. And I'll warn you, a lot of people are having difficulty with this discernment because we want very quick answers, sound bites, and quick solutions. And discernment requires time, maturity, patience, and prayer. Francis of Buenos Aires has brought to the papacy a knack for significant gestures that immediately convey very powerful messages. He really is a tweetable pope, a soundbite pope. I loved Pope Benedict. I drank from his theological wisdom. I lived by it, but he was not very tweetable. It was very difficult to take statements of Pope Benedict to put on a t-shirt. You'd have to have words going t-shirt and a robe and a dress and everything else. Francis, there's an award-winning book that's out there right now by a friend and colleague, Michael O'Loughlin, called The Tweetable Pope. It's amazing. Think of some of the things from day one, and I was there from day one. I was brought to Rome when Benedict resigned. I arrived 2 days later and was told, you're the English language spokesperson now for the transition. So I watched all of this up close. I was in the Sistine Chapel. I was the last one thrown out when they shut the door and said extra omnes. I was the last one out. I had to be there to watch the cardinals taking the oath and everything. It was I had to pinch myself. I said, this is no longer a movie. Like, this is the real thing. And then to watch what happened on the night of March the 13th, 3 years ago, I shall never forget that as long as I live, because he was the dark horse. Nobody expected what happened. And he starts off the first days, and some of these sayings you know. How I would like a church that's poor for the poor. Have a good Sunday and have a good lunch. This caused the first theological crisis. It was the Sunday of the first Angelus address, 3 days after the election. I'm inside, the Secretary of State, in the building there where everything is happening. And of course, the first crisis was there was no script. Having no script in Rome for something is problematic, especially for those working in Rome. But he decided to go to the window. It was a freezing cold February or March day. And there he is, appearing at the window, praising Cardinal Casper for his book on mercy, which has caused some problems for some people. Not the book, but the Pope's praise. And then, of course, he ends the saying with Buona Domenica e buon pranzo. The woman who's kind of overseeing the Italian translations was there in the room with us, and she gasped. I thought she was having a stroke or something. She said, did you hear that? And I said, yeah. She said, what do you think? I said, he said, have a good Sunday and enjoy your lunch. She said, popes can't say that. I said, well, he just did. There's 100,000 people in the square. Well, we can't translate that. I said, well, we'd say it easily. Enjoy your Sunday and enjoy your lunch. Have a good meal. So they had a big conference call. It was on speaker phones, and you're hearing all these male voices and everything. In the meantime, my assistant and I went back to my office, and I was just laughing. So 15 minutes later, she walked by. Her name was Teresa, and she said, you won. He ends his sayings on Sunday. Why? Because most Italians go to the Sunday Angelus. They might consider that their Sunday obligation. After he gives his lovely reflection, Buona Domenica e buon pranzo. Ciao. And they go home and eat. Priests must be shepherds with the smell of the sheep. This is taken off. I've seen this all over the place now. But he's right when he says this. The Lord has redeemed all of us with the blood of Christ. All of us, not just Catholics, everyone. Atheists? Yes, even the atheists. This caused some problems for some people who are watching every word he says. A couple months after he was Pope, he decides to go to Lampedusa, an island off the coast of Sicily. It's a vacation island that's now become the great dumping grounds, and it's basically a burial grounds for all these boats coming over with the immigrants. He had told his colleagues right after he was elected, I want to go to Lampedusa. Oh, no, Holy Father, it would be very dangerous for you to go. It'll take months. You go get settled. You're going to move over to the Apostolic Palace and get out of the hotel. I want to go to Lampedusa. Oh, no, Holy Father, it's not possible. It would take 6 or 7 months to do that. So he called around commercial airlines and said, I'm going to Lampedusa. So they had to move into full gear. He goes to Lampedusa, an incredible visit, where he goes there in a boat, throws flowers into the water, and gives a homily saying, we've grown into a globalization of indifference. Nobody cares anymore. He was prophetic in those words and that gesture, because now look what's happened 3 years later with this massive refugee crisis of these people trying to escape horrific situations. Who am I to judge? Mamma mia, what that cost. I was in Rio de Janeiro for the World Youth Day. The plane had taken off, taking the Pope back to Rome. I remained in Rio because a lot of us couldn't leave the same time. And we had just gone over to the beach to rest. We had worked all week. It was terrible weather. It's the winter. Everybody thinks you're in the sunshine. We'd gone over to the beach. The phone rang, 25 phone calls. The Pope's plane had landed in Rome. The journalists got off. And then who am I to judge becomes the big title, as if it's a free-for-all. I'm the one who had to translate the text. I got the audio tape to translate what he said. Who am I to judge if a gay person is truly seeking God in his life? And then he quoted the Catechism of the Catholic Church immediately after of what the Church says about homosexual acts and homosexual orientation. The Pope never approved. He simply said, who are we to judge if somebody is truly seeking God? Anything he says can be taken or misinterpreted. Anything any pope says can be taken or misinterpreted. But what that expression did was to give many, many people deep consolation, especially when they're struggling with sexual orientation issues. I want things messy, stirred up in the church. I want the church to take to the streets. He spoke these words in Rio de Janeiro during the World Youth Day. I happened to be with the mayor the day that he said that. The mayor turned to me and said, "What a lovely expression, but not right now. We got 3 million people sleeping on Copacabana Beach." I am a sinner whom the Lord has looked upon, when he identified himself in the wonderful interviews to the Jesuit publications. It was my authoritarian way of making decisions that created problems. That he described very honestly that he was named provincial at 36 years old during a dirty war going on in Argentina, and he made some tough decisions. He admitted his humanity and honesty. Some said popes shouldn't say that. They should never admit that. The Pope is not following the script of Love Story that says love is never having to say you're sorry. Remember that stupid line in Love Story? Remember when that movie came out? I grew up in an Italian family. We spent our lives saying we're sorry, okay? And when I watched that movie, we were allowed to watch most of it. We had to leave the room for some of the scenes. And I remember listening to that line, and I told my mother, I said, "That's stupid. How come they can say that? We can't say it just because you're Italian, okay?" I see the church is a great field hospital after battle. This whole idea of the field hospital is taken off. He's used it many times. Everybody thinks he's coined the expression. But I tell you, this is not a Bergoglio expression. This is drawn from the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. It goes back a long time. The image of the church I like is that of the holy, faithful people of God. And then, I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it's been out in the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. These are all from different homilies, from different things he said. These expressions, these words, have profoundly touched people. He's connecting with people, just as Francis de Sales connected with ordinary people. God never tires of forgiving us. God alone knows how many times he said this expression. The dogmatic and moral teachings of the church are not all equivalent. I have this dogmatic certainty: God is in every person's life. An evangelizer must never look like someone who's just come back from a funeral. I dream of a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything. Mercy is the greatest of all virtues. The confessional must not be a torture chamber. The church is not a toll house. I beg you, bishops, avoid the scandal of being airport bishops. This has been a wonderful thing, because in the past couple of years, inevitably I bump into bishops or cardinals in the airport. "Oh, hi." And the first thing is, let's not say we met here. We need to promote a culture of encounter. How can it be that it's not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is news when the stock market loses 2 points? Asked if he would ever baptize Martians from Mars, he responded one day at Mass, "Who am I to close the door?" And then one of the best ones of all, last November, he's giving a homily about 2 years ago, November, about simplicity of life. And these homilies in the chapel of Santa Marta, doesn't have any script. He's speaking as a pastor from his heart. And he's talking about worldly possessions. And he looked up and he said, "How many of you have ever seen a hearse going to the cemetery with a trailer attached to it?" And everybody kind of stopped and said, "That's right. It's about possessions." He's got this uncanny ability to drive home the point. He's not speaking theological platitudes up there. He's speaking realities that everybody can respond to. And many people are not only responding, but they're taking action on this. Initially, many of us, myself included, have thought that the Pope, his free-flowing interviews and homilies and quotes, are more of a source of consternation and frustration than opportunities to learn more about the Church, her founder, and her message. But Francis is teaching us that he's chosen many different opportunities to communicate and speak and encounter the world. No matter how fraught with potential confusion and misinterpretation these messages may sometimes be, the world is now listening to a pope in ways that they have never listened before. This is not to say that his predecessors were not listened to, but Francis has an uncanny ability to connect. Some people are criticizing and saying, well, this is just the honeymoon period. These journalists don't believe them. They're not. But I can tell you, honeymoons don't last this long. This is not the honeymoon period. People are listening to this man. And one of the privileges, extraordinary, unexpected privileges I have, especially for the past 3 years, is to deal with the secular media, primarily the secular media, the big networks in the English-speaking world, especially during the papal visits, during the trips, during the papal transition. And I have witnessed miracles, transformation, and conversion, several of them in Philadelphia and Washington in this past September. I'll tell you 2 of them in very pleasant moments. The morning that the Holy Father addressed the United States Congress, a moment I shall never, ever forget, and Father President was there, your Father President was in the Congress. I was in the Senate Rotunda with all of the networks while the Congress is taking place in the large room where you saw it on TV. And I was with all the leaders of the networks and the cameras and everything else, and it was electric. It was electric where I was. I could imagine what it was like in the chamber, the Pope of the Holy See when he came in. And he gave that magnificent address. And at one point, one of the senior people from ABC came over to me. I had earphones on. I was glued to the monitor. I had tears coming down my face when he started naming the heroes of our culture, when he named Martin Luther King, when he named Abraham Lincoln, Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton. I mean, this is big-time stuff. The guy came and tapped me. I took the earphone off. He said, can I ask you a question? I said, yes. He said, is it normal that most of us are crying here right now? And I had tears. I said, no, because I am too. It was extraordinary in Washington. In Philadelphia, we experienced that performance, a royal performance, the night of the vigil on Benjamin Franklin Parkway. And he's got a wonderful way. Usually he'll take the text, and you can tell when he's kind of looking at it, and he'll give it to the poor young priest that's with him. He said, now we're going to talk. And that night, he not only talked, but he connected and gave a magnificent catechesis about marriage and family life. I was sitting in the CNN anchor booth, Chris Cuomo and all the rest of them, and they figured he's going to give another speech. They had the printed text. And all of a sudden, they ordered pizza, so pizza comes in the booth there. I mean, they got it. And Chris recognized that the Pope was going off script, and he understands a little Italian. I understand the Italian, and I said, hold on, guys. I said, we gotta watch this. And then when he started that talk about marriage and the beginning of creation, and he said, and where did God choose to send his son? Did he send him like to a factory? Did he send him to a business? No, he sent him to a family, because that's what it's all about, a family who's got their doors opened. And I'll never forget the senior anchor people from CNN said, put the pizza down. This is big time. He was connecting, and it's happened all across the board. It's happened in Bangui in Africa. It's happened in the different places he's visited. Happened in St. Peter's Square. During the month of the Synod in October, I was with him every day. He connects with people. He's not playing any role other than a pastor walking among the flock. What is his most important achievement in these past 3 years? And he's got much more to do. I really believe that he's rebranded Catholicism and the papacy. Prior to Pope Francis, especially in the years prior, not as a criticism by any way to Pope Benedict's brilliance and theological wisdom. I loved Pope Benedict. He was poorly served, and it was in a situation of becoming unwound. The scandals, the butler, the crisis, and it was very hard running a Catholic media outlet because people didn't believe us anymore. Oh yeah, what next? The big question was, when people saw me in the media, did the butler do it? And I said, really, that's not our point. It was tragic for that great Pope. But I can tell you right now, we would never have Pope Francis unless we had the wisdom and the bold courage and the humility of Pope Benedict to do what he did. When he realized he could not continue, and the humility of that great man to step down and to open up the whole election process. The unique thing about the conclave of 2013, was there was no funeral. There was no spirit of hovering, the mourning and the weeping and the comparison. The cardinals came together to really talk about the issues of the church and to choose the right person who can carry the church forward. And I can tell you during those very tense 10-day meetings, everything was discussed. And I kept on praying every night, the poor guy who's going to have to pick up the baton and run with it. He's rebranded Catholicism. Before, when people would ask, so what's the church all about? The church is about what we're against. We're against abortion. We're against gay marriage. We're against birth control. We're against this. We've caused a huge sex abuse crisis. You've lost credibility. Today it's quite different. There's still the cynics. There's still the dumb newspaper articles that come out. But nowadays, what are people talking about? They're talking about the Pope. They're talking about the Pope's concern for environment, the Pope's passion for refugees, the Pope's embrace of that man with all the boils on his face, the Pope who entertained a circus troupe yesterday at the general audience, Wednesday at the general audience. He's won over people. By no means is this an indication that everybody's embracing papal teaching and church teaching, but he's changed the playing field. He's done something many of us had hoped for and longed for. And many of my colleagues in the secular media industry have said that Francis has made it fun once again to be a religion reporter and a journalist covering the church. He's changed the image of the church so much that prestigious graduate schools of business and management are using him as a case study in rebranding. This past Hanukkah, I was with some wonderful Jewish friends in Toronto, great friends, and we know each other well, and they tease me and whatever. So the father of the family said, "All right, let's be honest. How'd you guys do it?" I said, "Do what?" They said, "What ad company did you hire to change this whole thing?" I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Like you must have brought in some kind of consultants in the Sistine Chapel that kind of rigged this whole thing." I said, "We did. It's called the Holy Spirit, and there was no cost." To those in several countries, including this country, you say the Pope is not speaking enough about abortion. Let me remind you, not only is he pro-life about abortion issues, but he has a wonderful sense of the consistent ethic of life from womb to tomb. And he's talked about this continuously. In many of his addresses, when he's talking to young people, within 2 sentences of addressing young people, he talks about grandparents. When he talks about abortion, he talks about the consequences of abortion in euthanasia. He's very aware of both of those things. He talks about the silent euthanasia of when we put old people away, when we throw them away. He keeps on using the words, the throwaway culture. The inability of commentators, and some within the church, to pigeonhole Francis into a single category is very frustrating to some. He's strongly opposed to parties or lobbies in the church. He does not compromise on the hot-button issues that divide the church from the secular West, a gap that liberals would like to close by modernizing doctrine. Yet he's also not a pope for the Catholic right. For him, contrasting positions held together in tension, loyal to fundamentals but open to the action of the Holy Spirit, are necessary to forge a new, better consensus, and the differences make for an honest and open discussion. He wants us to sit down and talk rather than condemn people, rather than to label people and to dismiss them. And if we can't agree on everything, what can we talk about and agree on together? And this is extremely important, especially as this nation faces a national election. The principal mission of the church, he said, is evangelization, to bring the good news to everybody. This was also Benedict's mantra at the 2012 Synod on the new evangelization, months before he resigned. Benedict told us at that synod, the church exists to evangelize. This is the only agenda of Francis, to lead people to Jesus Christ so that their joy may be fulfilled. Now, there's a couple key themes that have emerged which show us how he's chosen to communicate with the world. I've kind of looked over the past 3 years. I see everything that comes out of his mouth, and everything in English, and sometimes I have to translate it. So I know everything he's spoken and what he says, and there's some key themes running through all of this that have been wonderful instruments of communication. The first one is joy. It's the weapon of mass construction. What they didn't find in Iraq when George Bush sent everybody over, we have the weapon of mass construction in the church. It's joy. And we have a number of people in the church who are killjoys, and they don't want this. He's smiling too much, okay? He looks very happy. Why is he talking about mercy all the time? We have a whole bunch of people that would like to have a year of judgment rather than a Jubilee year of mercy. In Evangelii Gaudium, which is the great apostolic exhortation at the beginning of his pontificate, he tells us, I want you to be warm, welcoming, and forgiving. Eat with tax collectors and sinners. Forgive the woman caught in adultery while admonishing her to sin no more. Welcome and respect foreigners, even your enemies. And above all, do not judge. He's spoken simply, powerfully, and beautifully about returning to a lost unity, a desire to achieve a missing fullness, a disarming invitation to simply come together to witness to the beauty and the love of Christ. Is that bad news? He wants to build bridges that everyone can cross. He's especially conscious of the poor and those who have been marginalized, social outcasts, kept on the fringes of society. And if anybody has a right to speak about that, he does, when you consider from where he comes. He walked his talk and he walked the walk in Argentina, and that's one of the great reasons why his brother cardinals chose him. On the need for joy in evangelizing, he's written, there are Christians whose lives seem like Lent without Easter. Do not look like people who have just come back from a funeral. On being close to the poor, he writes, an evangelizing community gets involved by word and deed in people's daily lives. An evangelizing community builds bridges and bridges distances. He speaks about a church which goes forth, la chiesa in uscita, he keeps on saying. My Italian cynical friends say, uscita, uscita, you got to come back home and stay home, though. A church whose doors are opened. Often it's better, he says, to simply slow down, put aside our eagerness, listen to people, stop rushing from one person to another. The church must preach salvation and not doctrine. An imbalance occurs when the church speaks more about law than about grace, more about church than about Christ, more about the Pope than about God's word. And he's very frustrated when he's with groups of people, especially Europeans and Latinos. Oh, Francisco, Francesco, Francesco. He says, stop screaming my name and scream out the name of Jesus. That's much more important. Evangelization must be an invitation to respond to God's love. On the need to keep the doors to the sacraments opened, he said very clearly, the Eucharist, although it is the fullness of the sacramental life, is not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine and nourishment for the weak. And many of us are waiting with great anxiety, great expectation for the apostolic exhortation on the synods, which is said to come out in March of this year. The church's internal wars, he said, the tendency to form groups of elites, to impose certain ideas and even to engage in persecutions which appear as veritable witch hunts, are a counter-witness to evangelization. Whom are we going to evangelize if this is the way we act? And finally, I've already said, he says, in a world, especially in some countries, different forms of war and conflict are reemerging. We Christians must remain steadfast in our intention to respect others, to heal wounds, and to build bridges. The second big thing of this pontificate is his sense of urgency. Urgency. We give in to this great attitude, laxitude I call it, of consultation. Let's have a think tank. Let's bring somebody in. Let's have a long discernment process. Let's reflect on this. And many times, it's important. Many times not. They're stall tactics. Francis is filled with this biblical urgency. For him, authentic power is service. He reminds us day in and day out that evangelizing is neither social ministry nor spiritual ministry. It's both. The more we show genuine concern and effective action for alleviating social ills and liberating the poor, the more believable our gospel will be. Do not waste time. There's little time. And he's used the fact that he said, I'm not going to be here for a long time. He's 79 years old. He's not going to be here for 25 years. And he knows there's a limited amount of time. Let's do something. And nothing is stopping him. He reminds us that Christ did not find the church or found the church for saints and angels, but for sinners, people like us who strive for goodness and greatness, yet know that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. For over 2,000 years, we have not been in perfect order, nor will we ever be. In St. Paul's letters, the sins and excesses that he addressed were committed not only by pagans, but especially by the early Christians. The church has been dysfunctional from the beginning. We are sinful people in need of conversion. Nevertheless, we have something to do, and we must do it now. nostalgia, a very important point that comes up in much of what he says. His favorite scripture passage, without a doubt, is the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, Luke chapter 24. I rejoice quietly about that because it was my thesis at the Biblical Institute in Rome. And when I started hearing him speaking about this and keeping track of how many times he said it, and I told him in October when we were at the synod, I'm so happy you like Emmaus because I do too. And he just lit up, The story of Emmaus, there's an interesting principle taking place in that story. For those of you who have studied a little scripture, you got to ask the question, why did Luke spend so much time writing that story? Chapter 24 of the Resurrection Symphony, I call it, and it's the centerpiece of that, verse 12 to verse 35. Whereas Mark refers to it with 2 lines, Luke's got this huge section, Cleopas and his companion, and they're on the road, and Jesus is with them. It's a wonderful story. But why did Luke write that much when the other evangelists chose not to? And I believe, as the work of an exegete and the one who has to write about it, I believe that Luke was responding to a specific question of the Christians at that time. That the Christians at that time, after the resurrection, were probably saying to themselves, oh, if only we were back then, if only he were here now, we wouldn't have all these discussions, we wouldn't have all these difficulties, if only, if only, if only. We were hoping he would be the one to set Israel free. Sperabamus, the Latin text says. And a lot of us live in that, if only, if only, if only, if only. But we were hoping. Thank God we don't have religious congregations named the Sperabamus sisters, or the Sperabamus fathers. We were hoping, although some act like that. Okay? The reason why Luke wrote the story was to say, even those who walked with him on the road on the night of the resurrection did not recognize him. But you, 2,000 years later, have everything you need to recognize him. You have word and you have sacrament. You have the word of God and you have the bread and the wine. And it's in the Eucharist and in the sharing of the word that we recognize him. So stop complaining. Cut the nostalgia. And how many of us today in the church are afflicted with nostalgia. Oh, I want to go back to the good old days. When a young kid the other day in my office, 23 years old, wants to go back to the good old days, I said, when were you born? I said, the good old days? Oh, when the church was the real church, when I experienced mystery. I said, when's the last time you went to church? I went on Sunday. I said, what was happening in church? Well, it wasn't mystery. I said, what the heck is mystery? What are you talking about? We make up these stories, and many people are caught in that. Oh, this one, when it was wonderful. When nuns were nuns and priests were men, somebody told me recently. I said, they're still nuns and the priests are still men, okay? We're still there, so cut it. Stop it. Luke is telling us this story to say, cut the nonsense. Francis is saying the same thing. And Francis has embraced the story of Emmaus, and he's focused on another part of the story. The beautiful sense, what did the disciples say after they recognized Jesus and he disappeared? They don't start crying and say, he's left us. We're going into depression. We need a counselor to come and hold our hands. They turn to each other at the table and they say, were not our hearts gradually catching fire within us? I stress that. The real translation is gradually catching fire. Most of your translations will say, were not our hearts burning within us? It's that gradual catching fire, that warming of the heart that happens as the word is explained to us. In St. Matthew's Cathedral, when Francis met with the bishops of the United States, this is how he ended the talk. I was delighted to hear this. He said, consequently, only a church which can gather around the family fire remains able to attract others, and not any fire, but the one which blazed forth on that Easter morn. The risen Lord continues to challenge the church's pastors through the quiet plea of so many of our brothers and sisters, have you something to eat? We need to recognize the Lord's voice as the apostles did on the shore of the Lake of Tiberias. It becomes even more urgent to grow in the certainty that the embers of his presence, kindled in the fire of his passion, precede us and will never die out. Whenever this certainty weakens, we end up being caretakers of ash and not guardians and dispensers of the true light and the warmth which causes our hearts to burn. And every time the Pope has met with bishops who come for their ad limina visits, these visits they have to make every 5 years to the Vatican, almost every talk he ends with this: do your hearts burn with love of the Lord? When have we given in to nostalgia in our personal and ecclesial lives of faith? Do we truly believe that he's walking with us on the road? Are we capable of igniting new fires in people's hearts? The image of Emmaus permeates his preaching. Mercy. He's spoken about mercy from the first day, from the first Angelus address. He talks about it constantly. His whole motto that he's chosen as bishop, miserando atque eligendo, literally, chosen through the eyes of mercy. He speaks about the beautiful Caravaggio painting of the call of Matthew as having a huge impact on his own vocation. 17 years old, he goes into a church on his way to a dance in Argentina in high school, and he goes to confession, and he said, that was the moment when God touched me. Very much like the young Francis de Sales, when he went there before the statue of Mary in France and prayed, and he said the Memorare prayer. I was very struck by the painting in your chapel of the young man there. And that was the moment of conversion, much like Francis had his moment of conversion in the Church of the Flores in Buenos Aires. He said, feeling mercy changes everything. This is the best thing we can feel. It changes the world. A little mercy makes the world less cold and more just. We need to understand properly this mercy of God. What is the story within the story of the Jubilee of Mercy, which we are now experiencing? The Year of Mercy is one way to urge and encourage the faithful to put on Christ, who reaches down and out to the poor and needy. This is the Christ enshrined in that Jesuit maxim, not to be restrained by what is greatest, yet to be contained in what is least, that is divine. Francis wants to bring the whole church, beginning with cardinals, priests, and bishops, to the lowliest members, into the embrace of God's mercy. And I could think of no better timing than this Year of Mercy to be called. Look at the mess of the world. I'm 56 years old. This is the worst I've seen the world in my short lifetime. The violence, the terror, the fear, the shootings in this country, Paris, Lebanon, Africa, the places where the Burkina Faso 2 weeks ago, where these groups are claiming God, encouraging them to do things. This is not religious groups. This is fanaticism. And the Pope says, what is our response to that violence? Is it military arms, military incursion, military response? Is it more violence? The response, the antidote, is mercy. It must be mercy. He says, I often say that in order for this to happen, we must go out from our churches to go outside and look for people where they live, where they suffer, and we must give them hope. Laudato Si, the encyclical, a magnificent way of communicating with the world. It was the most written about encyclical before it was published. I never read so much nonsense in all my life in the 6 months before it was published, of people claiming to know the contents, none of whom have seen what was in the encyclical. And it's the climate change encyclical. It's the anti-life encyclical. It's this utter nonsense. But if you read that masterful document, my only critique is it's too long. If you read that document, it is an invitation to conversion, a breathtaking biblical vision of the world, an honest assessment of the mess that the world finds itself in, a creative attempt to respond, an invitation to turn to God. You know, we as Christians, we speak very often, God so loved the world that he gave us his only son. We see it on the football stadium at Notre Dame. We see it quoted, John 3:16 or whatever. But Laudato Si is an invitation to us to consider the world that God so loved. And what have we done with this world? Have we turned it truly into a pile of filth, as the Pope said? It's a privileged instrument of evangelization, of communication, of interreligious dialogue, of ecumenism, all together. Because if you can't accept all the teachings of the church, if you're outside the church, many people have come to the church through Laudato Si, reflection groups, thinking groups, talking groups, prayer groups. We just finished a 6-part television series on Laudato Si, which was released last week. I brought a copy to Father Tom. It's a spectacular 6 half-hour series with a study guide. Little did we know, we started it 5 years ago, little did we know that the crowning of that series would be the papal encyclical. Every year, the Pope issues letters for the World Day of Communications. And because he's been Pope 3 years, there's been 3 letters. The first letter that he wrote, the 48th day of communications in 2014, he said this: "How can communication be at the service and authentic culture? What does it mean for us as disciples to encounter others in the light of Christ? Those who communicate in effect become neighbors. The Good Samaritan not only draws nearer to the man he finds half dead on the road, he takes responsibility for him." 2015, last year, he wrote another wonderful letter, and his hand is really on this letter. He reminds us that modern media, which are an essential part of life for young people, can be both a help and a hindrance to communication in and between families. The media can become a hindrance if it becomes a way to avoid listening to others, to evade physical contact, to fill up every moment of silence and rest, so that we forget that silence is an integral element of communication. The media can help communication when they enable people to share stories, to stay in contact with distant friends, to thank others or seek their forgiveness, to open new doors to new encounters. And this year's message of communications, which was just released this past week, he said communication is the power to build bridges, to enable encounter and inclusion, and to enrich society. How beautiful it is when people select their words and actions with care to avoid misunderstandings. These words are very important, especially with our rapid use of texting and messages and things we would never say verbally to a person, that we say foolishly with emails. Or for some people told me the other day, emails are now ancient, but they're not ancient, I still use them, and text messages. This seemed to be what the Pope said last September in St. Matthew's Cathedral when he addressed the bishops themselves. And he told the bishops, harsh and divisive language does not befit the tongue of a pastor. How often in recent years we've heard that the Christian church needs to draw clear boundaries between it and the world and not build bridges. How often have we experienced words from our clergy that not only fail to encourage, but traffic in condemnation, judgment, and almost delight in breaking up relationships. Imagine what the bishops of our church thought when they heard those words in St. Matthew's Cathedral in September. Francis returns to the situation of pastors, and he tells them, I want your way of communicating as well as our service that never suggests a prideful and triumphant superiority, never demean people for whom the world considers lost and easily discarded. Let me conclude. This is a pope who has chosen many, many ways to communicate with us and communicate with the world. For those of us who claim to be evangelists and teachers and pastors and communicators, we must ask what truly motivates us for the work that we share. We share this work as co-workers with St. Paul, co-workers of the Pope, co-workers of our bishops. If we are not animated by joy, if we are fueled by anger, recrimination, condemnation, hostility, arrogance, meanness, or harshness, it's got nothing to do with Christianity and nothing to do with the church. Francis of de Sales taught us about gentleness and joy. Francis of Buenos Aires puts it into practice. What is he teaching us? What's Francis of Buenos Aires teaching us? He's modeling for us what it means to be able to love without limits, but also to be faithful in particular situation and with particular gestures. In his surprise pastoral visits, his spontaneous telephone calls, his handwritten messages, if you get a message from Santa Marta, you get the envelope, and on the back, he's got F, Casa Santa Marta. You know who it's from. He reaches out to the handicapped, to the sick, to children, to the elderly, the abandoned single mother who calls him on the phone and says, the priest just refused to baptize my child. He said, come here with the child, I'll deal with the priest. He deals with prisoners. He called somebody on death row recently. He's been actively involved in the case of prisoners on death row. And I was thrilled to have helped arrange this past week, a week ago Thursday, his meeting at the Vatican with Sister Helen Préjean. She attended Mass last Thursday and met with him. It was two kindred spirits who met. You know who Sister Helen Préjean is, dead man walking. I told her that day it was live nun and live pope walking and talking. Francis travels in that Ford Focus in Rome, and here in the small black Fiat on the east coast of the United States. He's made people sit up and pay attention. My favorite story about Francis of Assisi, this other Francis, is the one that's told by G.K. Chesterton. I was reading the biography just before the papal transition, and I remember reading these words, and I've read them since, and they jump off the page. And in the biography of Francis of Assisi, G.K. Chesterton, the great Englishman, wrote these words about Francis of Assisi and Benedict of Nursia. Listen to this. St. Francis must be imagined as moving swiftly through the world with a sort of impetuous politeness, almost like the movement of a man who stumbles on one knee, half in haste and half in obeisance. The eager face under the brown hood was that of a man always going somewhere, as if he followed as well as watched the flight of the birds. And this sense of motion is indeed the meaning of the whole revolution that he made, for the work that is now to be described was of the nature of an earthquake or of a volcano, an explosion that drove outwards with dynamic energy the forces stored up by 10 centuries in the monastic fortress or arsenal, and scattered all of its riches recklessly to the ends of the earth. In a better sense than the antithesis calmly conveys, it's true to say that what St. Benedict stored, St. Francis scattered. But in the world of spiritual things, what has been stored into the barns, like grain, was scattered over the world as seed. When I reread those words in light of what's transpired in the church these past years, what Benedict stored, Francis scatters. Francis' striking symbolism is becoming substance. Papa Francesco seeks a simpler church, more closely identified with the poor. He's undoubtedly aware of the scandals, the corruption, the hypocrisy, the challenges, the leaks in the lobbies, and the things that are broken and need to be fixed inside the Vatican and in the whole church. Pope Francis is reminding us each day and communicating with us each day the words of his predecessor, St. John the 23rd, over 50 years ago at the beginning of the Second Vatican Council. John spoke that day, October the 11th, 1962, these words: "The substance of the ancient doctrine of the deposit of faith is one thing, but the way it's presented is another." With Pope Francis, it really is the same story we've heard for ages. It's the same message he's communicating, but I can say this: my God, how the packaging has changed. No wonder why the world has stopped to listen and to pay attention and to take heart what this pastor from the ends of the earth is communicating to us, and how much Francis of de Sales and Ignatius of Loyola and Francis of Assisi must having quite a time watching this show on earth. Thank you.